Hi, I'm Linda Mowell, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Meadows Museum, and our interviewer, Francesca Hall, speaks with curator Nicole Atzbach about the exhibition Picasso Rivera, Still Life and the Precedence of Form. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, I'm here with Nicole Atzbach at the Meadows Museum to talk about their new exhibition, Picasso Rivera, Still Life and the Precedence of Form. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks so much for coming today.
Yeah, so this exhibition really explores the relationship between Picasso and Rivera. Can you tell us what sparked you to curate the show?
So, two things. There was the Columbus Museum of Art wanted to borrow our Picasso right here for an exhibition they were doing on the war years. And so in exchange, they very generously agreed to lend both a Picasso and a Rivera. And so with that, we were able to get started on an exhibition. And the idea behind it was this interesting relationship that evolved between the two artists during the war years, during World War I, and especially 1915. All four of the works on this wall here were all created 1915. And so I think when you have them together, it makes for this really compelling visual story about how the two artists were riffing off each other, essentially.
Definitely.
So that was the basis for the show. And then in our own collection here at the Meadows, we have other great works in our collection that are slightly later. We have a Juan Gris and a Maria Blanchard, and those were also created during the war. And then we also have this great portrait by Rivera from 1915 of the Russian writer Ilya Ehrenberg. It was a show that would complement our own collection and put our own collection in focus and tie all of these works together in this narrative. Yeah. And so I think it worked.
Yeah, it definitely worked. This is such a great show. So before we get into the stories behind how they met and how they came together in Paris, what was going on in Paris at this time, like 1915?
So essentially the war broke out in 1914, right. And a lot of the artists in the city enlisted for the war, and even foreign artists tried to enlist. Matisse tried to enlist, He was rejected. Diego Rivera, the Mexican artist, right, from Guanajuato, he had been living in Paris since 1911. He tried to enlist, and he was rejected. Right. So Modigliani. So this group of artists that we have here in the exhibition were all artists who were working in Paris during the war.
Okay.
There's also another component which I think is really interesting. Picasso's main dealer prior to the war was a man named Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, and he was of German origins. And so he was forced to leave Paris. He was exiled in Switzerland, and he began writing about Cubism and sort of creating the terms for Cubism that we're familiar with today, analytical Cubism and synthetic Cubism. And his whole inventory was sequestered in 1914. So Picasso was very irate about that. He wasn't happy about it. And so another dealer took over, a man named Leonce Rosenberg. Okay. And so he was able to take over some of the sequestered inventory. And every single artist in this exhibition signed contracts with him. Oh, wow. And so there's also this sort of market that's going on, and this, the artists needed to make money during the war. Yeah. And so this was the dealer that they turned to. And so I think when you look at these works together, it's interesting to see how the market also influenced the language of these paintings and how they look visually.
That's so interesting. And you mentioned Cubism. There's a quote by Rivera talking about him and Picasso discussing Cubism and how it was their thesis.
Right.
How does the Cubist movement inform the works in this show specifically?
So the analytical Cubist phase was the first phase that was during the first decade of the 20th century, and that essentially originated with this partnership between Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. Georges Braque went off to war in 1914, and so that was the end of the partnership between him and Picasso. And then around 1912, 1913, the language of Cubism changed, and it shifted into what we call synthetic Cubism. So analytical Cubism were these canvases that were very monochromatic, and it was about sort of dissecting and breaking apart forms. And synthetic Cubism was born out of these experiments that Picasso and Braque and Juan Gris were interested in about 1912, 1913, when they worked in collage, and they worked with pasting newspaper and wallpaper in their canvases. And then after that, it sort of evolved into this very colorful phase of Cubism, synthetic Cubism, that lasted until basically 1919. And as you can see from the works in the exhibition, it's very vivid and colorful. And it's really about playing with forms.
Right.
And so it was a major shift from the first phase of Cubism.
Definitely. So how did Picasso and Rivera come to meet?
Diego Rivera came from Mexico, and he first worked in Europe and Spain, and then he ended up in Paris in 1911. And he was in Europe on a scholarship from Mexico. And he was finding his way through Cubism, but it was not directly through Picasso. It was through what we would call the second phase of Cubist artists. Jean Metzinger, Robert Delaunay, Fernand Léger, Pierre Mondrian, who was his neighbor. And he was able to finally get what would be his first and only monographic exhibition in Paris at the Bertweil Gallery. And that took place in 1914. And during the run of that exhibition, he was told that Pablo Picasso was interested in meeting him. And Picasso was like a god to Rivera, and he writes about this meeting and how it was this really solemn rite of passage. And it's quite a funny story. He was painting these two Japanese artists, and they were dressed in togas, and they had ribbons in their hair. And this painting of them was in the Bertweil exhibition. And they were followers of the modern dancer Isadora Duncan, who was very into Greek dress and dance, and so hence the togas. A Chilean painter, Manuel Ortiz de Zarate, came into the Rivera studio and said, "Picasso wants to meet you." And so Rivera dropped his brush, and he brought Ortiz de Zarate and the two gentlemen he was painting, and they all went together to meet Picasso. And they went to Picasso's studio first, and Picasso showed him around, and they had lunch together, and then they went to Rivera's studio and looked at what he was painting. And then in 1915, the relationship between Picasso and Rivera shifted. Rivera saw this painting that Picasso had painted, and it was originally titled "Man Seated in Shrubbery." And he became incensed. Rivera had painted this work called Zapatista Landscape, which for him was a major painting. He called it the Mexican Trophy. And he thought that Picasso essentially was plagiarizing from him. And the very specific point was that Rivera had come up with this shrubbery, this foliage that he had created by scumbling different paint together to make it look like, shrubbery. And he noticed that Picasso had incorporated this sort of trademark technique into his man seated in shrubbery. And that basically was the end of their relationship. Jean Cocteau, the poet, he wrote rather humorously about how all the artists began to shut their studio doors after that for fear that Picasso or someone else would steal their ideas.
Oh, no.
So, and then there were rumors that Rivera wanted to have a duel with Picasso. So it's a very funny story.
Yeah.
So that in essence was the argument. And so Picasso changed that work drastically. He painted most of the shrubbery out, and the two works also had this very pyramidal type of composition, and so he shifted it so it wouldn't look so similar.
Right.
And actually Picasso's friend, Max Jacob, who was a painter and a poet, when he first saw Rivera's Zapatista landscape, he thought it was a work by Picasso. That's the crux of this argument between the two, and it was very funny. But, there is something to it, because if you look at what Picasso was painting, the Columbus work, and then you compare it to the Meadows painting, these other works by Rivera that are in the show from the LBJ Library in Austin and from Columbus, those were painted prior to the Meadows painting, and I think it becomes clear that Rivera really was an influence to Picasso at this time. And they were really interested in, around 1915, this idea of incorporating a still life within a landscape, which is essentially what the painting from the LBJ Presidential Library, the Rivera, and the Rivera from Columbus, and our painting. It's the combination of these two genres of painting, which really stems from Matisse. Matisse was working on the same thing, and also Juan Gris. And so these two these artists that were working in Paris during the war, they were, essentially in close quarters and really feeding off of each other, and you can see that from the works in the exhibition.
And you definitely see that in the show. It's a great show. And thank you so much for speaking with us.
Sure, it was a pleasure.
This was great.
We want to thank Nicole for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to meadowsmuseumdallas.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.